That day began the way days that seem unremarkable begin. A leaden sky over Portland, a fine drizzle clinging to the windshield, and the calendar notification reminding her of family reunion, 11:00, childhood home. Caroline had slept little, not out of anxiety, but because of that rare stillness of someone who has already understood the script to come and decided not to act as before. At 9:40, she started the Porsche unhurriedly. She chose a plain sweatshirt, white sneakers, and her hair pulled back, as if she wanted to erase any sign of triumph that might provoke an easy reading. She knew she wasn't going for a hug. She was going for a balance sheet. In the passenger seat, a folder with printed financial statements, the draft of her foundation statement, and a pen that didn't write well. The drive down Burnside brought back images she hadn't asked for. 3 empty chairs at her wedding, 90 faces trying to hide the gap, the photographer avoiding that angle. At 10:55, she pulled up in front of the wooden porch her father had sanded 1,000 times. The smell of damp pine was still there, untouched, as if time had only moved on for her. From the sidewalk, Caroline measured the scene with the precision of someone who learned to read variables before sensing them. Closed windows, crooked blinds, the paint on the railing peeling from winter, and that dense silence of houses where numbers are discussed that no longer add up. She didn't text Ethan to say she had arrived. They had agreed not to turn the day into a couple's chronicle. She let herself in with her old key, a courtesy no one had removed, and found the living room slightly different. Pictures rearranged, Logan's college trophy in a more visible place, the coffee table stacked with magazines to hide a stain. She paused for a moment in front of the childhood portrait frame, the one where she appears smaller around the edges, half out of focus. She didn't feel anger. She sensed data. The UB had the smell of the Sundays of her childhood, but without the sounds that gave meaning to that smell. At 11:03, the wall clock struck 3 times, a tick that sounded like a starting bell, and she understood that the important thing wasn't what they were going to ask of her, but what she was going to hold without trembling. Richard was the first to appear from the kitchen, with a rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was wearing the same plaid shirt as always, though the collar was more worn. Elaine, behind him, was carrying a tray of cookies, trying to recover a domestic image that hadn't made sense in years. The initial exchange was a choreography of empty phrases. "You look nice. It's been a long time. Your car is impressive." No one mentioned their absence from the wedding. No one mentioned the 5 years of silence. Caroline sat opposite them, crossed her legs, and waited for the first sentence to cut through the fog. It came quickly. "Your brother is going through a difficult time," Richard began, while Elaine nodded with a mixture of guilt and hope. Deep down, Caroline already knew they hadn't called out of affection, but out of necessity. And yet her voice remained calm, almost professional, as if she were attending a risk assessment meeting. Logan entered a few minutes later, his face pale and his eyes sunken, the expression of someone who had lost much more than money. He attempted an awkward hug, which Caroline didn't reject, but didn't fully reciprocate either. The silence between them weighed more than the words to come. On the table, Richard spread out some papers, bills, bank notices, lawyers' letters. Elaine began an emotional speech, filled with phrases about family, solidarity, and the courage to stand together in difficult times. Caroline listened without interruption, observing each pause like someone measuring the precision of a script repeated too many times. At one point, the word "help" appeared, accompanied by "temporary." It was then that she understood that they didn't want to reconcile. They wanted to redeem their former privilege. The atmosphere changed when Caroline asked them to be clear, how much money they needed, and for what. Elaine lowered her gaze. Richard adjusted his glasses with a nervous movement, as if preparing a defense. Logan finally blurted out the figure, $380,000 to avoid foreclosure and cover the business's debts. Caroline didn't react. For a moment, the clock rang again, filling the space no one dared to occupy. Instead of answering, she opened the folder she had brought with her and placed a document on the table with the title Rivera Media Scholarship Foundation. The three of them stared at the letters, not entirely understanding, believing it to be a new investment project. Richard was the first to ask what it meant, and Caroline, in a calm voice, explained that it was the destination of most of the money from the sale of her company. At first, no one spoke. Elaine let out a shaky breath as if she hadn't heard correctly. "A foundation?" Logan repeated with a mixture of disbelief and resentment. Caroline nodded. She told them that she had decided to allocate $16 million to scholarships and mentorships for young women who, like her, had grown up without emotional support in their own homes. Her tone wasn't one of revenge, but of purpose. She said she wasn't doing this out of resentment, but out of consistency. Richard tried to laugh, but it quickly broke. "That's crazy, Caroline. Family comes first." She replied slowly, her voice still firm. "My whole life, family came first. But I was never that family." The words hung in the air, and Elaine was the first to break. She wept without visible tears, with the silent cry of someone who doesn't accept guilt, but rather a loss of control. Richard looked at her helplessly, as if waiting for Caroline to relent. But she didn't move. There was no rage on her face, only a strange calm that hurt more than anger. Logan, elbows on his knees, murmured that he didn't understand how his sister could give millions to strangers and deny support to her own flesh and blood. Carolyn took a deep breath before answering. She explained that each scholarship had a name, a story, and that they were all born from the absence she herself had felt. That it wasn't charity, but reparation. She didn't speak to convince them, but to make a point of something. She no longer needed to justify. When she got up from the table, the clock struck almost noon. No one stopped her. Caroline grabbed her coat, crossed the front door, and walked toward the car, the cold wind tangling her hair. She felt a mixture of relief and emptiness, as if she had just released a weight she had carried for decades. She paused for a few seconds before getting into the Porsche and looked toward the dining room window. The three of them were still there, motionless, behind the, fogged-up glass. There was no epic music or triumphant phrases in her head, just absolute silence. For the first time, she understood that she didn't need to close any wounds with words, because the act of standing firm was, in itself, a form of healing. On the way home, Caroline let the sound of the engine drown out her thoughts. The city passed before her like an emotionless documentary. Gray buildings, hurried pedestrians, flashing traffic lights. Somewhere on the highway, she remembered how she had spent years seeking recognition in the same eyes that judged her today. She remembered the forgotten birthdays, the unanswered messages, the excuses that always began with, "Your brother needs more from us." Each memory hurt less, as if the distance in time had transformed the wounds into simple facts. In the rearview mirror, the reflection of her face seemed clearer, as if something inside her had finally aligned. That afternoon, in her apartment overlooking the Willamette River, Caroline opened her email and saw dozens of congratulatory messages for the sale of the company and for the foundation. Among them, one caught her attention, a letter from a 20-year-old woman named Maya, who told her story and expressed her gratitude for the opportunity to apply for one of the scholarships. "You don't know me," the girl wrote, "but reading your story made me feel like I'm not alone." Caroline read the letter twice, her eyes moist. It wasn't an explosive emotion, but an inner warmth that reconnected her with something that had been dormant for years, the feeling of belonging, not out of obligation, but by choice. The following days passed calmly, but not silently. Caroline received interview invitations, messages from journalists, and requests for collaboration. Her story had begun circulating online without her planning it. Some called her an example of empowerment, others, the woman who set boundaries for her family. However, she wasn't looking for labels. She just wanted her experience to help someone else. Ethan, her husband, watched everything with a mixture of pride and caution. making sure Caroline didn't get lost in the media exposure. At night, he would find her on the balcony, gazing at the city lights, in that reflective silence that precedes a new stage in life. Meanwhile, the foundation began to take shape. Naomi Blake, her former mentor and now the project's executive director, organized the first selections of fellows. Caroline attended the inaugural meeting in a small auditorium in downtown Portland. There, standing in front of a dozen nervous young women, she recognized something familiar in their expressions, the mix of fear, talent, and desire to be seen. During her speech, her voice trembled for a moment, not from insecurity, but from the magnitude of what she was building. For the first time, the words pride and family made sense in the same space. The foundation's impact grew faster than Caroline expected. Within weeks, local media began covering the stories of the first beneficiaries: a photographer from Seattle, a programmer from Austin, and a young screenwriter from Denver. Each account shared a unique story, and reading them, Caroline felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. But along with the public attention, also came family reactions. Logan posted on social media insinuating that his sister had abandoned them for money and fame, and Elaine shared passive-aggressive messages about the loss of the value of the modern family. None of it surprised her, though it hurt. It was the price of choosing her peace over her guilt. One morning, while checking emails in her office, Caroline received a message from her parents' lawyer. They wanted a private meeting to resolve misunderstandings and restore family harmony. The tone of the email was so calculated that she read it twice to make sure it wasn't a disguised financial request. She consulted with Ethan and Naomi, who agreed that she shouldn't expose herself to emotional manipulation again without being prepared. Still, Caroline agreed to the meeting, not for them, but for herself. She needed to close the cycle from a position of calm, not defense. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday at a discreet downtown cafe. Caroline arrived with an empty folder, a silent declaration that she had nothing more to offer. Her parents were already there, sitting across from each other, the tension visible even in the way they held their cups. Seeing her, Elaine forced a smile, while Richard stood, trying to regain a tone of authority that no longer existed. Caroline sat down, ordered a tea, and waited. It was the parents who broke the silence, talking about past mistakes and how much the estrangement hurt them. But she didn't succumb to nostalgia or the desire to repair the irreparable. She listened, breathed, and when her turn came, spoke without raising her voice. If you want a reconciliation, start with family therapy. Not for me, but for yourselves. Richard looked at her as if he'd just heard a blasphemy. Elaine tried to soften the conversation, saying that all of that was behind us, that the important thing was to start over. Caroline stood firm. There was no anger, only clarity. She explained that forgiveness wasn't a door opened for convenience, but a process that required truth. She told them she was willing to see them again, but only if they acknowledged what had happened and committed to healing. No one responded. The silence was so long that the waitress had to come over and ask if they needed anything else. Caroline shook her head, left the money on the table, and left without looking back. This time she didn't feel emptiness, but a calm akin to freedom. The days following that encounter brought a sense of closure. Caroline returned to her routine, devoting more time to the foundation and the new projects that emerged. Maya, the young woman who had written the letter to her weeks earlier, became a constant presence, volunteer, apprentice, and little by little, a kind of living mirror to her past. Caroline watched her tenderly when she spoke enthusiastically about her short documentary, or when she arrived at the office with tired eyes from working nights. In her, she saw an opportunity to break the cycle, proof that pain could be transformed into purpose. That connection reminded her that her story no longer belonged only to her, but also to the women who came after her. One afternoon, while she was reviewing some campaign materials, Naomi interrupted her to show her a viral post, a video telling her story titled, From ignored daughter to mentor to hundreds. Thousands of comments flooded social media. Some expressed admiration. Others recounted similar experiences of familial favoritism and emotional abandonment. Caroline read them silently, moved by how her private decision had touched so many lives. In that moment, she understood that exposure wasn't a burden, but an opportunity. She vowed to use her voice not to display wounds, but to accompany those still searching for their own. That night, Portland seemed quieter than usual. Caroline went for a walk alone, wearing a light jacket and dangling her headphones around her neck. The air smelled of impending rain, and the lights reflecting on the pavement gave the city an almost warm glow. At a corner, she stopped in front of a bookstore where she had once spent hours dreaming of being recognized. She smiled as she remembered how many times she imagined her parents walking in unexpectedly to congratulate her on some achievement, something that never happened. But for the first time, that thought didn't hurt. It was simply another memory, an archived image. She had learned that absence can also teach us lessons. If you're watching this part of the story and you're still here, it means something in you connects with what Caroline once felt. Take a second, breathe, and tell us where you're watching this video from. Every place someone listens from makes this story more meaningful. And if you feel like someone needs to hear it, please leave a like so it reaches more people. Sometimes, sharing a true story of overcoming difficulties can be just what another heart needs to not give up today. When she returned home, Caroline found Ethan waiting for her with 2 cups of coffee. They didn't speak much. A glance was enough to understand that they both knew what this moment meant. It wasn't the end of a battle, but the beginning of a new, calmer life without needing to justify every step. Caroline settled into the sofa, checked her phone, and saw one from Maya. A photo of the group of interns working on the Foundation's first short documentary. "This exists thanks to you," the text read. Caroline responded with a smile and a simple, "No, thanks to us." As the months passed, the Rivera Media Foundation established itself as a national benchmark. Several universities began collaborating, and the first projects won awards at local festivals. Caroline attended the presentations without seeking prominence. She preferred to stay at the back of the auditorium, watching as other voices occupied the space she had believed for years she didn't deserve. Maya became a natural leader among the fellows, and seeing her like this confirmed to Caroline that her decision to invest in them was the best use of her fortune. In every smile, in every story told with authenticity, she recognized a piece of herself that had finally found its place. Still, life continued to bring subtle challenges. In a television interview, a journalist tried to provoke her by asking if she regretted choosing strangers over her own family. Caroline remained calm, smiled, and replied, "I didn't choose between one or the other. I chose between continuing to repeat the silence or using my voice." The phrase went viral within hours. It was quoted in articles, used in empowerment campaigns, and written on university posters. For her, however, it wasn't a public declaration, but rather an intimate truth. She had learned that it wasn't about revenge, but about being consistent with what she always needed to hear, and that no one told her. Over time, even the echoes of their past began to fade. Elaine mailed a card at Christmas with a brief message, "We're trying to change." Caroline didn't respond immediately. She boxed the card with old photos and a few letters she'd never had the courage to throw away. She felt neither anger nor sadness, only a necessary distance. She knew that forgiveness doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means stopping the bleeding from a wound that's already healed. Ethan hugged her that night, and they both silently toasted the peace that comes when one stops seeking emotional justice in places where there never was any. Maya, for her part, was preparing to travel to New York on an international scholarship. Before leaving, she wanted to say goodbye in person. In the office, she hugged Caroline tightly and told her that her story had been the reason she didn't give up on her dreams. Caroline looked into her eyes, moved, and wished her luck. "Do what I couldn't do when I was your age, believe you deserve it," she told her. When the young woman left, Caroline was left alone for a few minutes watching the door close. That simple scene, a farewell without tears or promises, confirmed to her that she had accomplished something bigger than a personal goal. She had broken a pattern. One spring morning, while reviewing the Foundation's annual reports, Caroline received an unexpected email. It was from a family therapist who said they'd been contacted by Richard and Elaine. The message explained that they had started therapy and that they wanted to talk to her again eventually, but only when they were ready to do so without excuses. Caroline read those lines 3 times, unsure exactly what to feel. It wasn't relief or euphoria or even mistrust. It was something simpler, the certainty that change, although delayed, was possible. She saved the email in a folder labeled Pending Closure and decided not to respond yet. Sometimes patience is a form of self-respect. That day, as she drove to the office, the Portland sky dawned clear. The sun streamed through the windshield, reminding her that somehow life kept giving her second chances. Stopping at a traffic light, she saw a father and daughter laughing inside an old car. She didn't feel envy or sadness. She just observed the scene with a faint smile. She understood that she had spent a lifetime searching for something that, in reality, she had learned to give herself. It wasn't about having a perfect family, but about building one where love didn't depend on silence. That same week, Naomi organized an event to celebrate the Foundation's 2-year anniversary. In the auditorium packed with young people, volunteers, and mentors, Caroline took the stage without notes or a prepared speech. She spoke only from her heart. She said there was no linear path to healing and no magic formulas for curing childhood. Sometimes, she said, life teaches you that not being chosen is also a form of freedom. The audience gave a standing ovation. Among the excited faces, Caroline caught a glimpse of Ethan discreetly recording with his phone, proud, and Naomi watching her with a smile that mixed affection and admiration. When she stepped off the stage, a group of young people surrounded her to thank her. They told her how her story had inspired them to study, to leave abusive relationships, or simply to believe in themselves. Caroline listened to each word as if they were puzzle pieces finally fitting together. That night, as she walked toward the parking lot, she realized her life had taken a direction she couldn't have imagined. She had transformed the wound into an inheritance, and although the path there had been difficult, it was worth every step. The echo of their applause lingered in her mind, reminding her that there is no greater void than not daring to be who you are. A year later, on a random Sunday afternoon, Caroline decided to go for a drive aimlessly. Portland was quiet, with a gentle wind rustling the leaves of the trees. She started the engine of the Porsche, that same car that had once been a symbol of independence, and now represented only another part of her story. As she continued through the streets she knew by heart, she noticed 2 figures across the sidewalk, Richard and Elaine, walking slowly, arm in arm. She didn't approach. She didn't honk the horn or roll down the window. She just watched them for a few seconds, calmly. There was no more bitterness, only a silent recognition that each was following their own path to redemption. That night, upon returning home, Caroline opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence. Family isn't always inherited. Sometimes it's built on respect and choice. She closed the notebook, poured herself a glass of wine, and looked out the window at the moon's reflection on the river. She knew her story didn't have a perfect ending, but it did have a true one. She had learned to live without seeking validation, to forgive without expecting apologies, and to love unconditionally. And in that balance between past and present, she felt a peace that depended on no one else. The next day, Caroline returned to work at the Foundation. There were new applications, projects to approve, and dreams to fund. The routine, far from monotonous, had become her way of thanking life. Between meetings, smiles, and emails, she continued to find reasons to believe that each shared story had a purpose. As evening drew to a close, as she walked toward her car, she thought about how far she had come since that day of the family reunion. She smiled. Overcoming challenges hadn't been a moment, but a constant choice. As time passed, Caroline began receiving invitations to give talks on female leadership and resilience. At first, she hesitated, having never considered herself a speaker, but Naomi insisted that her voice had power precisely because of its authenticity. So, one autumn afternoon, she took to a university stage in front of hundreds of students and told her story without embellishment, with the natural ease of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone. When she finished, a young woman in the audience approached her to say, "I thought I was the only one whose family made me feel invisible." Caroline hugged her wordlessly, understanding that this was the true impact of her journey, breaking the isolation that silence imposes. That night, when she returned home, Ethan was waiting for her with an envelope in his hand. It was an official invitation to a charity gala where her foundation would receive national recognition. Caroline laughed, incredulous, and asked if there had been a mistake. Ethan shook his head. "You deserve it," he said simply. She thought about how ironic it was. For years she had begged for a look of pride from her parents, and now strangers were looking at her with genuine admiration. But this time she didn't feel emptiness, but gratitude. Life, she understood, sometimes returns love from other directions, just when you stop asking for it. On the day of the gala, Caroline chose a simple dark blue dress without ostentatious jewelry. She didn't want to look like a successful businesswoman. She wanted to represent all the women who had once been underestimated. When she took the stage to accept the award, she briefly glanced at the audience and thought about how different that applause felt. It didn't sound like validation, but like a conversation between equals. In her speech, she spoke of the value of setting boundaries, the importance of healing without losing compassion, and how acts of self-love can have real social effects. Her voice trembled at one point, but not from fear. It was contained emotion, a reflection of having walked a path that no longer hurt. After the ceremony, a journalist approached her to ask one last question. What would you say to 20-year-old Caroline, the one who was still waiting to be seen? She smiled thoughtfully and replied, "I would tell her that there is nothing wrong with wanting love, but that sometimes respect is the love we must first learn to give ourselves." The phrase appeared in several headlines the next day and was shared thousands of times. However, what moved Caroline most was a private message she received that evening. It was from Elaine, her mother, saying that she had seen the interview and, for the first time, understood what her daughter had meant all those years. That night, Caroline read the message several times without responding, not out of indifference, but because she knew words need space to settle. She closed her phone, made herself some tea, and stepped out onto the balcony. From there, she watched the distant lights of downtown, wondering how many people were going through the same process of letting go without hate. Ethan approached silently, put a blanket over her shoulders, and stayed by her side. They didn't speak, but that shared stillness was enough. Caroline thought that perhaps true love wasn't the kind that demanded constant presence, but the kind that knew how to accompany even in silence. The following weeks were peaceful. Maya sent her photos of her life in New York, filming, exhibitions, new friendships. Each image was a confirmation that Caroline's purpose had transcended her own history. Meanwhile, the foundation continued to grow. New programs included mentorships, international scholarships, and workshops on mental health. In each project, Caroline emphasized one idea: financial independence is worthless without emotional independence. The fellows listened attentively, aware that she was speaking from experience, not from a manual. She saw in their faces the hope she once thought was lost forever. One day, while reviewing documents in the office, Caroline received an unexpected call. It was Elaine. Her voice sounded different, more measured, as if speaking from a place of humility. She said she'd been in therapy, that Richard was trying too, and that she wasn't calling to ask for anything, only to thank her for setting boundaries. Caroline was silent for a few seconds, letting those words sink in. Then she replied, calmly, "That's a lot." There were no tears or long apologies, just a human conversation between two people who, for the first time, listened to each other without expectations. When she hung up, Caroline felt such a profound peace that she didn't need any confirmation that the cycle was complete. That night, when she got home, she lay down on the couch with Ethan and told him what had happened. He hugged her without saying anything, understanding that there wasn't a triumph to celebrate, but something more important: reconciliation with one's past. Caroline realized that forgiveness isn't a one-time act, but a practice repeated each time one chooses not to carry what no longer belongs to them. She looked toward the window and saw the rain falling, soft, persistent, almost symbolic. She thought that for years she had longed for that kind of closure, but when it finally came, it didn't need fanfare or tears, only silence. And in that silence, freedom. The next day, Caroline visited the Foundation's new headquarters, a bright building in the heart of Portland, decorated with photographs of the first fellows. At the entrance, a metal plaque was engraved with the words, "To all the women who were once invisible and still continued to create light." Reading it, she felt a lump in her throat. Naomi hugged her and said, "This is your legacy, Caroline, and it's just the beginning." She nodded with a smile. She didn't need any more recognition or awards. What she had built transcended her name. It was a structure of love, respect, and purpose that would continue to grow even after she was gone. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Caroline walked along the Willamette River pier. She wore a gray scarf and her hands in her pockets, enjoying the kind of solitude that feels weightless. In the distance, a mother played with her daughter, throwing pebbles into the water. Caroline stopped to watch them for a moment, and without knowing why, tears filled her eyes. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. She had learned that true success lay not in money or approval, but in being able to look at life without resentment. She smiled, took a deep breath, and kept walking, knowing it had all been worth it. If you've made it this far in the story, it means something Caroline went through touched you deeply. Tell me what city or country you're watching this video from, and if any part of her story reminded you of something special about yourself. Don't forget to leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that they can move forward, even if it hurts. Sometimes, a true story can be the spark another heart needs to begin anew. That night, Caroline drove home slowly through the brightly lit streets of Portland. The reflection of the headlights on the windshield reminded her of all the roads she'd taken to get there, the silences, the rejections, the battles that were never made public. As she parked, she stayed in the car for a few seconds, breathing calmly. She no longer felt the urge to prove anything. The woman who had once sought validation now sought only peace. As she climbed the stairs, Ethan was waiting for her with a tired smile and a hug that spoke volumes. In that everyday gesture, she understood that her story wasn't about loss or revenge, but about finding her place in the world without asking permission. In the following months, Caroline continued to expand her work with the Foundation and began writing a book about the Fellows' stories. It wasn't a tale of their success, but a collective testament to female resilience. Each chapter told a different story, an echo of what once was her own pain. And as she wrote, she realized that the most healing stories aren't those that end happily, but those that transform pain into purpose. She closed her laptop one night, looked out the window, and smiled. There was no ending, because overcoming, for her, would always be a way to continue living.